You're crouched in tall grass, roughly 1.8 million years ago, somewhere on the edge of a river you don't have a word for. The light is dropping fast. Your group is scattered, foraging, half distracted, and you're the one who sees it first. A shape moving low through the reeds on the far bank. Patient, deliberate, closing the distance the way predators close distance when they've already decided your dinner. You open your mouth. What comes out is a sharp, urgent bark, the kind your whole body already knows how to make. You point. You wave your arms. You grab the nearest person and pull them backward, hard, hoping the panic in your grip says what your throat can't. But you can't tell them where. You can't tell them how many. You can't tell them it circled around from downstream 20 minutes ago, and it's already cutting off the route back to the trees. All of that information exists, complete and correct, inside your head. And it dies there, because the only tools you have to move it into someone else's head are a scream, a shove, and a look on your face. Someone doesn't move fast enough. You don't get a name for what happens next, because you don't have names yet, for anything. Just the sound the group makes afterward, low and long, in the dark. That gap between knowing something and being able to hand it to another mind is the entire problem this video is about. There's no fossil of a sentence, no layer of rock where language shows up, dated and labeled, which means the honest answer to when humans started talking is genuinely embarrassing for a species this advanced. We don't know. Estimates range from 50,000 years ago to over 1.5 million, depending on which scientist you ask and which kind of evidence they trust. Some think it happened almost overnight, one freak mutation flipping a switch. Others think it crawled forward in tiny stages over a scale of time that makes ancient feel like the wrong word entirely. Today we're going through what the actual evidence says, where it contradicts itself, and why the search for the first word turned into one of the messiest arguments in all of science. Here's the thing that trips people up immediately. Humans are not the only species that communicates, not even close. Vervet monkeys in East Africa have distinct alarm calls for different predators. One bark for eagle, a different one for leopard, a different one again for snake, and the rest of the troop reacts correctly before they've even looked up, running for cover from an eagle call or scanning the grass for a snake call. Honeybees returning to the hive perform a waggle dance that encodes the exact direction and distance of a food source relative to the sun, and other bees read it and fly straight there. Humpback whales sing structured songs that spread across entire populations and change year over year, like a slow-moving cultural trend under the ocean. So what makes human language actually different, categorically? Not just louder or more complex. 3 things, and all 3 are missing from every animal system we've ever studied. First, displacement. The ability to talk about something that isn't happening right now, isn't in front of you, might not even exist. A vervet can't warn about the leopard that was here yesterday, or the one that might come tomorrow. Second, arbitrariness. The sound leopard has no physical resemblance to a leopard, and yet everyone agrees on what it means. A shared code with no natural connection to the thing itself. Third, and this is the big one, recursion. The ability to nest ideas inside other ideas without limit. To build a sentence about a sentence about a sentence. No alarm call, no waggle dance, no whale song has ever been shown to do that. Animals can tell each other what is. Humans can tell each other what was, what might be, and what someone else merely believes to be true. That gap is enormous, and figuring out how we crossed it is the entire mystery. Here's the fact that should stop you cold, because it demolishes the version of this story you were probably taught in school. For decades, the working assumption was simple. Language is what makes Homo sapiens special. Other hominins, Neanderthals especially, were grunting, gesturing, maybe managing a handful of crude calls, while we alone crossed some magical cognitive finish line and started talking. It's a tidy story. It flatters us, and the genetics say it's almost certainly wrong. In 2007, researchers sequencing ancient DNA extracted from Neanderthal remains in Spain found something nobody expected to find. They were looking at FOXP2, a gene tied directly to speech and language in modern humans. Not language in general in some vague sense, but specifically the fine motor sequencing required to move your tongue, lips, and jaw fast enough and precisely enough to produce fluent speech. Damage this gene in a human today and you get severe, specific difficulty with grammar and articulate speech. Not general intelligence loss, just language, cut cleanly out. Researchers expected Neanderthal FOXP2 to look ancestral, primitive, missing the key modern mutations. Instead, it came back essentially identical to ours. The same two critical amino acid changes. The same version. Which means the mutation that helps make fluent human speech physically possible wasn't something Homo sapiens evolved on our own after we split off and left Neanderthals behind. It was already sitting in the shared ancestor we both came from, at least 500,000 to 600,000 years ago, long before anyone who looked like you existed. Neanderthals didn't inherit some watered-down version of our language gene. They had the same one, running in a brain roughly the same size as ours, wired into a body built for the same kind of fine vocal control. So the actual first slam isn't when did Homo sapiens invent language? It's this. The biological hardware for language may be at least 500,000 years older than our own species. Something in that shared ancestor was already being built for speech, long before anyone had a reason to call it that. Long before there was a we separate from a them to even ask the question about. The first crack in that theory came from a bone the size of a fingernail. In 1983, in Kebara Cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel in Israel, archaeologists excavated the remains of a Neanderthal skeleton known as Kebara II. Buried around 60,000 years ago, this individual was almost complete. Ribs, spine, jaw, all preserved in remarkable detail for something that old. But the piece that mattered most was tiny, fragile, and almost never survives in the fossil record at all, the hyoid bone. The hyoid is a small, horseshoe-shaped bone that floats freely in your throat, unattached to any other bone in your entire body. It anchors the muscles of your tongue and larynx, and its exact shape, position, and height determine whether you're physically capable of producing the fast, controlled sounds that speech requires. For decades, scientists assumed Neanderthals had a hyoid built more like a chimpanzee's, positioned lower in the throat, angled differently, limiting them to grunts and simple unstructured calls. The bone that shouldn't exist. When researchers finally compared the Kebara hyoid to a modern human's, they found something nobody expected. It wasn't just similar, it was structurally identical, down to the muscle attachment points and the angle of the horns. A 2013 biomechanical study out of the University of New England, led by researcher Ruggero D'Anastasio, went even further, using 3D X-ray imaging and load-bearing models to test exactly how the bone moved and flexed, and confirmed it functioned the same way ours does, not the way an ape's does. So what does that actually mean? It means the physical hardware for speech, the precise throat architecture, required to produce the full range of sounds every human language on Earth depends on, was already sitting inside a species we spent an entire century imagining as speechless brutes grunting around a fire. That doesn't prove Neanderthals held conversations. Anatomy isn't the same thing as ability, and a working larynx doesn't hand you grammar. But it does mean one assumption can no longer survive contact with this bone, that speech was a switch flipped only in Homo sapiens, the moment we showed up on the scene. It's the prehistoric equivalent of finding a phone charger in a house you were certain had no electricity. The wiring was already there, tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to check. Somebody just had to use it. The second piece of evidence doesn't come from a fossil at all. It comes from a family living in London in the 1990s. Geneticists call them the KE family to protect their privacy, and across 3 generations, roughly half of them shared something strange. A severe, inherited difficulty with speech and language. It wasn't a hearing problem, and it wasn't a general intelligence problem. Affected family members struggled specifically with grammar, with sequencing the tiny muscle movements needed to form words clearly, with building and understanding sentences most children pick up automatically by age 5. In the early 1990s, linguist Myrna Gopnik was the first to study the family in detail and recognize the pattern wasn't random, it was inherited, running through the family tree exactly like a single dominant gene would, showing up generation after generation with almost mathematical consistency. The gene that runs a sentence. It took nearly a decade of further work before scientists found the actual culprit. In 2001, Geneticists Cecilia Lai and Simon Fisher at Oxford University pinpointed the exact mutation, a single altered gene called FOXP2. Later brain scans of affected family members added another layer. Researchers found measurable differences in Broca's area and the caudate nucleus, regions directly involved in planning speech and coordinating movement. One tiny change in one gene, and the ability to smoothly produce and process language came apart at the seams. Here's why that matters for a story about people who lived 60,000 years ago. FOXP2 isn't unique to humans. Mice have it, birds have it, chimpanzees have it. But the human version differs from the chimpanzee version by only two small changes. Changes that appear to fine-tune the brain circuits controlling fine motor sequencing. The exact skill needed to fire your tongue, lips, and vocal cords in the split-second order that speech demands. So this isn't a myth built on wishful thinking. It's a gene with a documented job description. And thanks to one unlucky family, we know precisely what happens when that job goes undone. Think of it like a single line of code buried inside a much larger program. Change it, and the whole application doesn't crash. It just stops running the one function everything else quietly depends on. And that's exactly the gene researchers later found sitting inside Neanderthal DNA, the human variant, not the chimpanzee one. The third piece of evidence isn't a bone or a gene. It's a doodle. On the southern coast of South Africa sits Blombos Cave, a site that has quietly rewritten the timeline of the human mind. In 2002, archaeologist Christopher Henshelwood and his team pulled two pieces of ochre from its layers, each engraved with a deliberate cross-hatched pattern. Not scratches from tool use, not random wear, but a repeated geometric design, carved on purpose, and published that same year in the journal Science. Later analysis dated the site's most famous engraved piece to roughly 73,000 years ago, with related engraved fragments reaching back even further, toward 100,000 years, alongside an entire ochre processing workshop. Abalone shells used as mixing containers for a deliberate paint-like compound. Why does a piece of red rock with a pattern scratched into it matter for a video about language? Here's the connection most people miss. To draw a symbol, a shape that stands for something beyond itself, that means the same thing to you today and to someone else tomorrow, you need a mind capable of abstraction. You need to hold an idea in your head that isn't physically in front of you, and trust that another person looking at the same marks will pull out a similar idea. That is, at its core, exactly what a word does. Blombos didn't stop at engravings. The same layers produced dozens of Nassarius shells, each one deliberately pierced with a small hole, strung and worn as beads roughly 75,000 years ago. Jewelry, in other words, made purely to communicate status, identity, or belonging to someone else looking at it. You can't have symbolic jewelry without an audience who understands the symbol. And you can't have an audience who understands the symbol without some shared system for agreeing what it means, which is language doing its quietest, earliest job, long before anyone wrote a single sentence down. Think about the last time you sent someone a single emoji instead of a paragraph. No words exchanged, yet an entire feeling landed perfectly. Someone in a cave on the coast of Africa was already running that exact trick, 75,000 years before smartphones existed. The bone gave these people the hardware. The engravings prove they already knew how to use symbols to mean something to each other. The fourth piece of evidence doesn't come from a dig site at all. It comes from watching monkeys pick bugs out of each other's fur. In the 1990s, British evolutionary psychologist Robin Dunbar noticed something odd while studying primates. Across dozens of species, the size of an animal's social group tracked almost perfectly with the size of its neocortex, the outer layer of the brain responsible for complex thought. Bigger brains, bigger groups. And primates hold their groups together through one very specific behavior: grooming. One monkey picking through another's fur for nearly a third of its waking day, not for hygiene, but to build trust, alliances, and social debt over time. Here's the problem. When Dunbar plugged human neocortex size into his formula, it predicted a group size of roughly 150 people, now known as Dunbar's number, and still cited in everything from military unit design to office org charts. But grooming doesn't scale. You physically cannot pick lice off 150 different people and still have time left over to eat, hunt, or survive the day. Grooming simply runs out of hours. So what replaced it? In his 1996 book, Grooming, Gossip, and the Evolution of Language, Dunbar proposed that talking became our grooming. Language let one person maintain social bonds with several others at once, through voice instead of touch. A single conversation doing the relationship work that used to require physically touching one individual at a time, one after another. And it's not a small side effect. Dunbar's own research team later analyzed recorded real-world conversations and found that roughly 2/3 of ordinary human talk is social in nature. Who did what? Who's trustworthy? Who broke the rules? Who's seeing whom? Not weather, not tool-making, people. That's not a flaw in how we use language, some accidental byproduct of a tool built for something else. That may be the entire reason it exists in the first place. It's the prehistoric version of a group chat. You can't physically hug 50 coworkers to stay on good terms with all of them, but you can absolutely keep every one of those relationships alive with a well-timed message. Every time you catch up a friend on office drama, instead of trading practical survival tips, you're doing exactly what Dunbar thinks language evolved to do in the first place. The fifth piece of evidence asks a strange question. What if language didn't start with words at all? What if it started as music? That's the theory archaeologist Stephen Mithen laid out in his 2005 book, The Singing Neanderthals. Mithen argued that before humans had grammar, sentences, or even individual words with fixed meanings, early hominins communicated through something he called holistic, manipulative, multimodal, musical, and mimetic. Picture a single melodic phrase, rising and falling in pitch, paired with gesture and rhythm, that conveyed an entire message at once. Danger, over there, move now. The way a siren communicates urgency without a single word attached to it. It's not as far-fetched as it sounds. Remember that hyoid bone from Kebara? The same throat architecture that allows fine control over speech also allows fine control over pitch and melody. And inner ear studies on Neanderthal remains suggest a hearing range tuned toward the frequencies used in vocal communication, not just alarm calls. The hardware for song and the hardware for sentences may have been the exact same equipment, doing two different jobs before language split them apart. The click that never left. There's a living clue to just how far back this split might go, and it's sitting in southern Africa today. The Khoisan languages, spoken by groups like the San, use click consonants, sharp, percussive sounds articulated with the tongue, completely absent from almost every other language family on Earth. Genetic studies, including a widely cited 2009 analysis led by Doran Bahar, place Khoisan-speaking populations on the deepest, earliest branching lineage in the entire human family tree, splitting off over 150,000 years ago. That timing is the whole point. If the deepest, oldest branch of humanity still speaks in clicks today, it hints that our shared ancestral phonetic toolkit may have been far stranger, richer, and more musical than the narrow set of sounds coming out of your mouth right now, and that most branches of the family simply lost that range along the way. The same way a language loses an old word nobody uses anymore. Think about how a 2-year-old communicates before real words arrive. Through tone, through rhythm, through a single drawn-out that somehow says everything. Maybe our entire species did exactly that for tens of thousands of years, before anyone bothered inventing grammar. Now, before you walk away convinced Neanderthals were sitting around debating philosophy, let's be honest about the strongest objection to everything you just heard. Having the parts doesn't mean you're using them the way we assume. Linguist Philip Lieberman has spent decades making exactly this argument. A hyoid bone shaped like ours only tells you the raw components were present: muscle, cartilage, bone. It says nothing about the soft tissue that actually shapes sound, the exact position of the larynx, the shape of the vocal tract above it, none of which survives 60,000 years in the ground. Lieberman's own reconstructions of Neanderthal anatomy suggested a shorter throat cavity that may have limited certain vowel sounds modern humans produce effortlessly. And FOXP2? Finding the human version of a gene inside Neanderthal DNA proves the ingredients were there. It doesn't prove the recipe got cooked. Some researchers, including linguist Dan Dedu, have pointed out that a shared gene only sets an upper limit on what's biologically possible. It says nothing about whether that potential was ever actually used. A car with a working engine isn't the same as a car that's actually been driven anywhere. That's a fair point. And it's worth sitting with for a second instead of brushing past it just because it's inconvenient for the story we want to tell. But here's why most researchers today still lean toward yes, they had something. The anatomical evidence, the genetic evidence, and the symbolic evidence from sites like Blombos didn't arrive one at a time from unrelated fields. They arrived independently, from completely different branches of science: genetics, biomechanics, archaeology, and they all happen to point the same direction, toward capability, not silence. One piece of contested evidence is a coincidence. 4 separate fields converging on the same conclusion, without coordinating with each other, starts looking a lot less like coincidence and a lot more like a real signal buried in old bones and older rock. Here's the part of this story that's harder to sit with. Somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 years ago, our ancestors built something extraordinary out of nothing. A system so powerful, it let a species survive ice ages, cross oceans, and pass down knowledge across generations who never met each other. And right now, in your lifetime, in the same species that fought that hard to invent it, we are losing that invention faster than at any point in recorded human history. Linguists estimate there are roughly 7,000 languages spoken on Earth today. According to UNESCO, one of them falls silent permanently, on average every few weeks. Not slows down, not fades a little, dies completely, the moment its last fluent speaker takes a final breath, and with them, an entire way of organizing thought, humor, kinship, and memory disappears from the planet forever. Some researchers project that by the end of this century, somewhere between half and 90% of the world's remaining languages could be gone. Most of them never recorded, transcribed, or translated before they vanish. So pause on that for a second. A language isn't just vocabulary. It's a record of exactly how one group of humans learned to describe their world. Sounds and grammar shaped by 10,000 years of a specific coastline, a specific forest, a specific way of counting time or naming color. When a language dies, we don't just lose words. We lose an entire irreplaceable way that a human brain once organized reality. The last known speaker of the native Alaskan language Eyak, a woman named Marie Smith Jones, died in 2008. When she went, so did the only living memory of how her people had described the world around them for centuries. Gone in a single afternoon, the same way it took a single afternoon 60,000 years ago for someone to invent it. That's the uncomfortable symmetry hiding underneath this entire story. It took our species tens of thousands of years, dozens of separate evolutionary accidents, and an entire cascade of anatomy, genetics, and culture lining up perfectly just to make language possible in the first place. And it can disappear from a single community permanently in the space of one generation not paying attention. One grandmother who stops being asked the right questions before it's too late. So step back from the caves, the bones, and the click consonants for a second, because this story was never really about 60,000 years ago. It's about right now. Every single thing that makes up your day runs through this one invention. The text you sent this morning, the argument you almost had with a coworker and talked your way out of instead of throwing a punch, the joke that made a stranger on the train laugh, connecting 2 people who will never see each other again. None of that exists without the exact chain of accidents we just walked through. A throat shaped the right way, a gene that didn't break, a mind capable of scratching a symbol into rock, and trusting someone else would understand it. You didn't invent language. Nobody alive today did. You inherited it, fully assembled, the way you inherited eyesight or a heartbeat. And because of that, it's easy to forget it's an invention at all, rather than a basic fact of nature. But every culture on this planet is still running a live experiment with the exact same tool your Neanderthal-adjacent, click-speaking, ochre-carving ancestors were fumbling toward for the first time. Every slang word your generation invents, every accent that shifts a little more with each passing decade, every group chat, every inside joke, every language quietly disappearing in a village you'll never visit. That's the same process, still running right now in real time. We think of evolution as something that happened to us, safely finished, locked behind glass in a museum. It isn't. Language is still evolving inside your own mouth, one conversation at a time, exactly the way it evolved inside a cave 70,000 years before anyone thought to write it down. The only difference between you and them is that they were still figuring out the rules. You're just the version of the story that gets to keep going. So go back to that fire for a second. That sound in the dark, the one you couldn't quite place. It wasn't noise. It was the very beginning of everything that came after. The throat bone, the broken gene in one unlucky family, the ochre scratched into rock, the click that never left southern Africa, the song before the sentence. None of it happened because one genius stood up and announced, "Let's invent language." It happened the slow way, an accident of anatomy here, a mutation there, a symbol somebody dared to carve, repeated by enough people for long enough that it became real. And it's still happening. Right now, in whatever room you're sitting in, your own throat is running the same 60,000-year-old machinery, doing the same impossible trick, turning a private thought inside your skull into a sound that lands, whole, inside somebody else's. That fire went out a long time ago, but the voice that started around it never really stopped talking. You're just the one holding the conversation now.